in regards to what John Vervaeke was concerned about. I think that perennialism is almost too easy in that sense of dissolving into the oneness is for a contemporary Western person potentially dangerous because we don't live in that ancient cultural context when you could actually be a renunciate, when you could actually step outside of society to go inward and achieve some state of release from the cycles of samsara. I mean, maybe you can still do that, but I feel like as much as I flirted with the idea of going to India and pursuing the life of a sannyasin and renouncing the normal life that my parents wanted for me and that I was supposed to want. Um, I even considered becoming a rabbi for a time. This was when I was in that like kind of depressed, derealized state.
Mhm.
But I think we're called to do something different at this time, which is to I feel be more involved in the world and whatever the spiritual path means today. It's not to retreat to the mountaintop; it's to be down in the trenches.
Do you think that the free will debate and guys like Robert Sapolsky still publishing books called Determined, and every day people post videos of their non-duality realization where they're telling you that they've entered a state where they're just sort of flowing down a river now. um could it be that that's a necessary phase wherein a person is discovering that the seat of free will is not located where they'd been locating it, and that must temporarily manifest as the sense that free will has been an illusion all along, and that you have to move through that to get to that deeper seat? Because from absorbing your work and the work of others, and your um, elaborations on Whitehead's thought, the felt state it brings me toward or suggests to me is one in which the free will I'm exercising isn't about authoring thoughts or writing this next thought I'm going to have, or specifying even the specifics of what I'm about to do physically, right? I do jujitsu and sometimes you find it's just happening. But there's a discerning self that's paying close attention and discerning the moral valuation of the various imaginal trains that pass through the station, and the attention there. The, there's a decider when it comes to that attention. Um, and so I feel like, if a young person comes to you and says like, hey, I'm having these non-dual experiences wherein I've seen through the separate self and I understand there's no free will, insofar as they're discovering that they're not the active thinker of each thought, it's really valuable. But that we more and more want to be encouraging people at that phase to not see it as the permanent dissolution of an agent, but as a deepening into identity with the true agent. But what I hear you saying is we have too much work to do to give ourselves some free pass of none of this is our responsibility. You said in one of your recent essays, I have a quote here, that the source of the astonishing capacity of free market societies to self-organize is only, quote, invisible because it first flows into the physical world out of human hearts. our social and economic bonds do not just take care of themselves. So it sounds like you're saying our institutions and markets don't self-organize in some spooky automatic way. Self-organization means organized by selves. And our systems may develop unplanned levels of ordered complexity, but their aims and outcomes can't exceed the moral depth of the human drives that birthed them. And so we have to center ourselves in our moral intuitions and know that we're going to continue to have thoughts and fantasies that fly in the face of those moral intuitions all the time. And our job is simply to notice that. And then the will portion comes in that you can, of course, you can never fully grasp it or distill it. You can't find the thing that's deciding, but we have to inhabit a sense that we are moral agents. Um, and I'm trying to find my way to a question here. So Whitehead places centers of experience as the basic units out of which uh, world is made. First and foremost, there are experiences being had, experiences overlapping, and a diversification and intensification of these felt experiences in a creative process. Um, and the shape of the systems this creative process produces has its initial root in something very immediate and visceral. It's it's so close we look past it. Um, and he's encouraging a foregrounding of visceral sensation and discerning the moral charge of these various sensations and using what we call the will to aim them properly so that the systems that are of a much higher order of complexity that we couldn't plan or understand, but nevertheless flow from us, will take a shape that reflects our deepest value of compassion and beauty. Is that uh that's what I'm being um beckoned toward, a view I feel beckoned toward through many of the conversations I've heard you have, what I've been able to glean from Whitehead, the matter with things, and so forth. How does that strike you?
That's brilliant, Roman. That's very, very well said. Um, I've been hearing about and I've listened to one or two conversations with Sapolsky and I've known about his work for a while. And I like the way that you're nuancing this point that in some way um, there is this cosmic flow and we are along for the ride. But on the other hand, um, to follow Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, there is this will at the base of all things. And what it would mean to have free will is not at all um, something that would be opposed to the flow of that one will. Like I have my own free will and you have your own free will. Uh, there is freedom, but I think to be free is to be capable of um, identifying oneself with that cosmic will. But the thing is, it's not this, the cosmic will is not this sort of amorphous, disembodied um, thing. It's that will sprouts up and into the world through each of us, right? So, yes, it's one will. And yes, we're all one as expressions of that will. But for that, what freedom is for each of us to recognize ourselves as expressions of that. And that we're all beneath the soil, part of the same root network, right? There are all these. causes and conditions that are shaping us. And to the extent that we can exercise freedom and creativity moment by moment, it's because we are interfacing with that root network where we're growing out of the soil that feeds and sustains us, and understanding all that contributes itself to supporting and sustaining us as a kind of medium. And we're artists, and we do have the ability to express um, through this medium, but the palette and the materials we have to work with are not of our choosing, right? And so um, we're given these circumstances and these generic characteristics, the bodies, the families, the race, the country that we're born into. And using that material, uh, each of us has a very unique and important contribution to play in expressing that one cosmic will.
Mhm.
And it's a subtle thought. Like on the one hand, I think Sapolsky is doing tremendous damage to the culture at large by pushing this determinism narrative. On the other hand, the type of free will that he's railing against is not something that I believe in either. You know,
Right.
it's kind of like with most atheists. I don't believe in the God they don't believe in either,
Yeah, yeah.
right? But there's a there's a there's a needle to thread here that allows us to still um, feel like we have meaningful contributions to make as agents in the world, as creators, as co-creators, but also creators, and that we're not just along for the ride. It doesn't happen by itself. We have to show up,
Yeah.
you know. Um, and I think it's damaging just to tell people that they're um, genetically determined to to behave in the ways that they do. That's not only is it dangerous, it's wrong, you
And
know.
there's another message happening at that same frequency that seems to oppose it, but ends up doing a whole other kind of damage, which is the like, just grab your life by the horns and like start controlling things harder. You're just not controlling everything hard enough. And like the people that win is because they ceaselessly exercise control over every detail of what's going on around them. And people then vacillate between like burning out and then dissolving. Uh, yeah,
Right.
and the point, you were talking to Bernardo Castro a while back, and I know he isn't, um, completely in on Whitehead's cosmology, but something you guys agree on, and that he articulates in a way that almost makes it seem so simple it's silly. When he'd call himself an idealist, in that everything is mind. Um, and what I hear from you is that it's sort of unnecessary to commit to an everything is mind way of looking at things, because what it doesn't really get us it doesn't do anything to say matter is mind, mind is matter. But what you guys agree upon, and what's helpful for me and seems logically um appealing, is the idea that we're starting from what we know to be true, which is that at least this part of the cosmos has an interior, and that's what I am. And the complex behaviors I carry out of negotiating and bonding and rejecting and accepting and striving and wanting, that compel my participation in the complex systems around me, are driven by values discerned by an experiencing subject. I simply know that to be the case. And I observe a cosmos full of other organisms that seem to be confronting a circumstance and then making a decision and thinking something's more valuable than something else and trying to survive and bonding and reproducing and experiencing conflict that transforms it. And I can either be conservative and say, well, I know what animates this part of the universe. Perhaps something similar animates that part of the universe, or the same fundamental energy. Or I posit the existence of something I can never confirm, which is the emergence of such behavior from blind mechanism. Uh, and it takes less work, and it's more logically conservative to uh, stick with what you know animates a part of the cosmos and extrapolate that, or deduce that that's the force driving the rest of the organisms. Um, it's funny because I thought of that as like, wow, it's such a simple point, but then it's kind of hard for me to get out there. But it seems like I'm surprised that's not a more compelling thought in even the pop culture-ish sphere of philosophy you find on the internet, just because it is so digestible. Like, I am a self, and that is what drives my complex activity. Oh, look, a little cell enacting complex activities. What could be driving it? Oh, perhaps a center of experience that gives any one of its moves its value charge from the vantage point of an experiencer. Why do you think people are so resistant to that idea when it seems very dignifying of the self in one way, which we as a culture are all about? Um, why is it that such a self-centered culture is so resistant to the idea of self as one of the driving forces of all of nature?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Um, if the universe really was this deterministic machine, you would think that things would be a lot more orderly and there would be less chaos and uh, contingency. But when you look at the history of the universe and the more we learn about physics and cosmology, it's just full of weirdness. Like, why is it that way? And you know, a, a process philosopher's response to that question is to say, well, all of this is not just who I am, but and who you are, but how the whole universe came to be. It's an expression of creativity. And all along the way, decisions were being made by atoms, by stars, by galaxies to take the forms that they did. Not conscious decisions, but there's always um, a halo of possibilities around every decision that is made. One thing is actualized, and an infinitude of other possibilities are not, right? And that happens at every stage of the evolution of the universe, and how we've ended up where we are now. I mean, this is so much more obvious, I would think, in the biological world, where you look around at the sorts of species that exist and the modes of life that have emerged, and um, most of it's beautiful, but it's also like, yeah, highly contingent. And biologists, almost all of them, recognize that if we were to rewind the clock and play it forward again, the sorts of species that inhabit the planet would be totally different. And so, yeah, all around us we see more reasons, I would think, to believe that um, this process of evolution, cosmologically and biologically, is checkered by contingencies, and it didn't have to be this way, and nothing is determining it to be this way. And so, looking at what is accumulated over the course of history, when we turn to face the other direction into the future, it's like, okay, this is open-ended, right? And drawing on our own human experience and our own sense of interiority and trying to start from there and build analogies to understand the rest of the universe, I think, on the one hand, is um, how indigenous people did it for tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. And something happened in the scientific revolution and the in the modern period in Europe where anthropocentrism became um, a sin.
Mhm.
And on some level, we don't want to, there's a certain kind of anthropocentrism that thinks all that matters is the human being, which is kind of self-undermining because if we don't take care of the rest of the planet, turns out we're not actually physically or spiritually separate from the rest of the planet. And so, any toxins we pour out into the environment very soon will be inside of our own bodies, right? So we want to avoid a naive anthropocentrism, but at a deeper level, we are expressions of this cosmic process. We belong here. We're not anomalies. We didn't get parachuted in from some other dimension, right? And so what we incubate and kindle within ourselves is this that traditionally was called soul, but just our interior experience of thinking, feeling, of willing. That is, it seems to me, an amplification of something that is at least latent throughout the rest of the cosmos.
Mhm.
And there's another philosopher and spiritual teacher that I've studied, Rudolf Steiner, who has this wonderful book that he wrote in the 1890s called Philosophy of Freedom.
Mhm.
And he has this framework that I just want to lay out because I think it's really helpful. Where we have two different kinds of perception. We have sensory perception of the external world, which is where we get our idea of matter, and I mean idea of matter. Matter is an idea, right? And so on that to that degree, I agree with Castro uh, about you know idealism versus materialism. I think idealism is actually way more coherent because you've never actually even encountered matter in any concrete sense. It's always been sensory perceptions. It's colored surfaces and textures and so on. Like that's not matter in this mind independent sense that we're taught in scientific circles to believe, right? So we have external sense perceptions that gives us this idea of matter. Then we have self perceptions, which is our bodily feelings and our sense of emotions that we have in response to what we perceive around us, or our sense of our self-percept is how we respond to our own past too, and our own memories, right? And so over the course of life, we build up this self-percept, and it often happens that we mistake who we really are for this self-percept, which is all tangled up with memories of things we've done in the past, other people's reactions to us, and so on. And that's our story, and that's um, impossible to do without, but also can very easily um, become a distraction and either lead to pride or um, a sense of self-hatred, and we just, we can very easily get lost in our self-perception. In addition to these two forms of perception, we have conceptual activity or thinking, which, from Steiner's point of view, is where our freedom actually manifests. Now, when we haven't turned our attention inward and discovered this thinking activity, um, it does seem to happen automatically. I mean, you don't have to try to think, you're thinking all the time. And it does take some training and exercise, spiritual exercise, to become conscious of that activity. But as soon as you become conscious of that activity, it's like you're discovering a creative activity within yourself. And so it starts to become impossible to say whether you've discovered it or you're creating it. And there's a certain kind of um, attention that once you've discovered, created it, you can't you can't lose it anymore. You can't forget that anymore. And it's not like, now all of a sudden you have free will. Now all of a sudden you can create your own reality. It's not like that, but you begin to be able to strengthen this thinking muscle, and this thinking activity can um, and I'm drawing on Steiner here. It allows you to conjure these um, moral imaginations, which are like ideals of what could be true, what could be the case, but it requires your participation to make it so.
Hmm.
And there's a translation process that has to happen between these moral imaginations that you can freely conjure and the deeds that would allow you to begin to bring them about,
Hmm.
right? Um, that that's also a muscle, right? The translation between the moral imaginations that your thinking activity can conjure and your ability to translate that into actions.
Hmm.
And so, but there's a pathway here to an enhancement of what I think we can call freedom.
And the
And but it,
discovery of that process, is that what you mean? Your book title's Crossing the Threshold. Is are you talking about realizing that's a process that can be engaged with, and it is the moral imagination equivalent to the etheric imagination, or is the etheric imagination the arena in which something like a moral part of it can be honed in on?
yeah, I think that
Okay.
that's well put. Um, Moral imagination and etheric imagination are related. And the first thing that's important to say about both of these is that it's not imagination of whatever kind is not inside your head.
Okay.
Um, Imagination is more like, when I use that term, I mean it more like what Whitehead means by creativity. This is a cosmic field, or a plenum, um, out of which everything is emergent, right? And so um, imagination isn't just make believe. It's not this um, sort of place that you escape to inside yourself and then engage in fantasy and make believe. If anything, imagination makes us. And the distinction between the etheric imagination and moral imagination is just a matter of what sort of inquiry we're engaged in. Um, in my book, I do talk about moral imagination, but I'm primarily focused on etheric imagination, which is more um, oriented around the question of what is this? What is nature? What is the cosmos? And how can we come to have um, insight into the natural world, not just as a collection of objects, but as a community of subjects?
Mhm.
And etheric imagination is a way of cultivating that resonance interior to interior. Um, Moral imagination is more about the question, who am I? Um, or who are we as human beings, as moral agents? Um, I I don't think of I mean, human beings have a lot of things that are unique about them, and one of them I think is that we're moral agents. I don't hold my dog or my cat morally responsible for their behavior.
Mhm.
Um, I think non-human animals and plants and even inanimate objects, mountains and meadows and so on, um, are moral patients. Like, we should care about them and think of them as having intrinsic value and whatnot. So they're moral patients, but they're not moral agents,
Mhm.
right? And this is an important distinction, I think, especially for environmentalists and people who feel very strongly about animal welfare and vegans and whatnot. And like, I have a lot of time for that type of open-hearted compassion for non-human beings. But it's important to recognize that human beings are different in the sense that we are capable of exerting moral agency. And I don't think, because as soon as you start saying that non-human animals have moral agency, then what you're saying is we have to hold them responsible for their actions,
Mhm.
you know? Um, and I don't think even the most intense animal rights activists really would want to do that.
Mhm.
So, so yeah, there's this important difference between moral and etheric imagination, but certainly they're related ideas.
So do you think that in the same way that people uh, get a taste of non-duality or realize they don't have the kind of free will they thought they had, and then they draw premature conclusions about the nature of will itself. In a similar way, when it comes to the power of imagination and the creative influence of imagination on the appearance of the world we inhabit, that people also get a taste of that, will feel themselves participate in the unfolding of events in a way they hadn't thought was possible prior. What I'm thinking of right now, you'll hear a lot of people that get very into the idea of manifestation, where they really, there was some intention they meditated deeply upon, and then they felt it exert a powerful influence, and then they jump all the way to like we decide our reality. It's all coming out of you. You just think about the life you want, and it will start unfolding. And what they are uh touching is a truth in the sense that there is a profound connection between our imaginal activity and the world we end up sitting at the center of. But there is a more particular causal process that can be studied, something like the physical world can be studied and seen to have consistencies such that scientific progress is possible. That just because we're dealing with a substance that's intangible doesn't mean it's not subject to any laws that need to be understood, or at the very least, patterns of behavior that coming into greater contact with is helpful. That we think, oh, it's in me, so it's just me, so it is what I want it to be, and I felt a thing, and that means that I'm manifesting all of my experiences. And then that leads to a kind of disillusionment when you come up against some kind of brick wall of life that makes you, again, fall back into that nihilism. And so I guess my question here is, do you think of the activity of the imagination as a natural phenomenon in the same way that cellular uh, growth and communication is, that could conceivably be approached with something like an objective method of study that we have yet to develop? And will individuals understanding the specific nature of that process by which the imagination influences reality, uh, will that be necessary um, for our progress as a species? Or so you can touch on that, but I'm going to let it bridge to a simpler question I had, which is, when it comes to inspiring virtue in human beings, do you think there's any adequate substitute for the saint? Like simply a human being whose presence emanates a kind of wisdom and compassion, and it's a felt orientation. People come into contact with it, and it doesn't need a very complex set of propositions to justify itself. Like Thich Nhat Hanh, he said a few things over and over again about coming back to the breath, being compassionate, and reducing the suffering of other beings. And it was such a deep part of his own being that it was in his voice, and it gets into you at a deep level. Um, and so the reason I go there is because whenever I going into the realm of like, could there be an objective science of the way the imaginal realm touches the objective world? There's so few human beings who are going to be able to go on that journey. And it could be that it's the job of those who do go on that journey. There's a trickle down effect, right? Like you have an influence on people in these communities of writers and scientists. They end up doing work that ends up getting translated into, bits of information people can digest, and over long periods of time, by osmosis, it gets into the culture. I know you have that Whitehead quote on your website where he talks about how, you could say philosophy does nothing. You could also say the waves of the ocean do nothing, but over long periods of time, they're submerging entire continents. And you could think of that as what's happening with philosophy. So I believe in that process of gradual osmosis, but in terms of meeting the immediate needs of what you might call the meaning crisis, the people fragmenting, feeling more and more lonely, more and more isolated from one another, uh, is there will we make it without saints?
I think I think saints have a role to play, and I do believe that there are exemplary, exceptional human beings, but like even Jesus got angry, and impatient at times.
Yeah.
Even Jesus, that last moment on the cross, was like lost faith, you know. And so the danger is that if we're searching for that perfect person to exemplify absolute virtue and holiness, we might we might not find it because everyone's human and has those flaws. And how many spiritual teachers do you think that we think are so wonderful, and then a student or two or three comes forward and whatever they did is for everything. It's like we don't want to get in a situation where we're expecting perfection from anyone.
Not perfection, but what I'd ask you would be, when it comes to your net influence as a human being while you're here, do you think in the end the greatest value of your foray into philosophy will be in the particular novel insights that you're able to articulate? Or does it have to do with the quality of character you're cultivating through that good faith method of inquiry itself, and that really you're going around and people are just, they're getting something from you, an orientation toward life that for you manifests as the rigorous process of analyzing the thought of all these thinkers, but in our organic contact with other beings, what ends up being more important is the attitude. It, and so when I say, is there any substitute for the saint? Right. I don't mean we need a perfect being, but um, if
I,
you,
I, I
yeah,
get you.
yeah,
Like virtue is contagious,
yeah.
and we learn how to be virtuous by example. Because I there's different schools of thought in ethics and morality. Virtue ethics seems to me to be um, it's both the oldest game in town and I think still the best, which is to say, being a moral good person is not something that you could create a list of rules or commandments uh, to follow to get you there. It's an attitude. It's a way of comporting yourself and responding to life, um, and it's contagious. And I think of um, I don't know where this idea came from, but a lot of Buddhists would say that the next Buddha is actually the sangha
Mm-hmm.
or the community, and that if this is related to what I was saying earlier about like for modern, postmodern people, like the idea of spiritual renunciation just isn't really on the table anymore, um, and that we can't expect there to be uh, an individual that's going to save us. I'm not saying that you're suggesting that, but um, that the the spiritual path nowadays um, is not different from uh, it requires just being more fully in the world, being more fully embodied, and being um, more fully human. And we have to do that together. Uh, I mean, this MLK quote gets overused, but it's just so profound. Where he says that I cannot be who I am supposed to be until you are who you are supposed to be.
Hmm.
You cannot be who you are supposed to be until I am who I am supposed to be. And it's like straight out of German idealism. Uh, you know, Fichte said he had this formula that sums that point up. No you, no I, no I, no you. And I think that kind of dialectic of mutual recognition is at the core of any spiritual awakening that we might hope for. I can't awake independently. I can't awaken independently of you.
I heard Michael Levin say something that was really fascinating about he was talking about the nodes in the bioelectrical network, gap junctions. um I'm going to do the specifics of the science. I'm going to butcher it, but the idea was that there's like these radio signals coming in, and for a while all the various members of the network um are discerning where the signal came from as well as the information it carries. Uh, and then what he looks at as the level jump to where they start being one mind are when that particular piece of information in the signal about where this message came from becomes irrelevant. It either stops arriving or it stops processing it. There's simply the message. It's us. It was my thought. It was your thought. Um, and it's an evocative image. It can be hard in this moment in time where it feels like we're doing anything but that as a culture. Um, the value of like where something is coming from is more important than ever, to the degree that you could be saying the identical words another person is saying, but you're saying it as a blank blank blank, and that completely changes the moral value now of an identical statement. And it feels like that that recognition of being the one is necessary, but it's so dangerous because we're so ego driven that it just inflates people so quickly. um that yeah, sometimes I'll be at like a coffee shop or something, and everybody's looking down at their phones, or even just an expression on their face that makes it very clear that they're elsewhere. And you fantasize about these moments where everybody just like looks up all at once, and you just start looking at each other, and there's just a sense of mystery um missing that I think is like a, a almost a fear. Like I think we can't skip the part of the beatific vision that instills some fear of God, like to really settle into a felt sense of the depth of mystery we're inhabiting. um is it feels it feels more necessary than any particular prescription of behavior that would come before it. And I think a lot of people taste it with psychedelics. Um, but psychedelics, I know, I've had communal experiences with them in like an ayahuasca circle, but most of the time it ends up being fairly personal experience, even if moments of it you felt very connected, um, it's hard to reference back to it. And it often just gets consumed and recontextualized by the more habitual self model that now says, I have particular insight because I had this experience. Um, and I know I'm looking for a way to get to that shared sense that we're inhabiting a mystery together, and that would inspire enough awe and fear that compassion would just seem like the appropriate response from a courageous place of like, okay, guys, like we're in this. This is scary. Like the potential for suffering here is huge and ever present. Um, and we can't escape. We can't leave. We are it. And like letting that settle in, not as a like, oh, I'm not gonna die, and it just like, no, it's also gonna be so painful so many different times. Suffering is one of the creative ingredients. It's like it's this is a process of creativity, and suffering is doing a we're gonna keep suffering forever on some level. And that that's the most horrific thought for most people they could ever think to, like that some version of suffering is eternal and it's always going to be you. uh but that unless we can touch that, then that response, that necessary response of like compassion that says like, and it's thank God I'm not, it's that you're here too, and you almost can feel, oh, this is perhaps why the one has dispersed into the many. Like we're gonna need company. This is hard. Uh yeah, that as a starting place. I know, that's in Buddhism. Life is suffering, but it people suffer a lot, and yet that part, it's rare to find someone who is able to center themselves in that, in the reality of suffering. I heard Michael Levin talking about how he loved to imagine a world in which we could amplify our compassion based on numbers in a way that we can't. Right? You hear about 100 people died, it doesn't feel that different from hearing that 1,000 people died. But I don't necessarily think, this like amplify, the bigger the number, feel more and more compassion. Oh, now there's 10 billion of us. Oh, so much more compassion. It only takes one other, like a real connection to the felt presence of the other, and an extension of goodwill that can only have the depth of your understanding of the shared situation that we're in. If your airplane was delayed, the level of compassion, for just the little discomforts of life, it's necessary, but it only gets us so far. And sometimes I'll find myself wanting to live from a deep compassion, but if I examine my motives in that moment, I just think it would feel great. It would feel great to love people that much. And that motive doesn't provide the proper scaffolding for the compassion to sustain. That the only way I get to a sustained compassion for other beings is if I'm really in touch with not just the fact that there's enormous suffering, but that there's always going to be, and there always has been. And I love the idea that the creative process of the cosmic unfolding is undecided, but to land on a question, do you think it could ever evolve to the eradication of suffering, or is suffering the very fuel that drives it?
There's no evolution, there's no growth without suffering. Um, I love everything you're saying, and I need to leave in a minute here, but this is such a big, big thought, a big vision that you're laying out. We're gonna need to have another conversation
Yeah, please.
about this
Please.
soon. But I couldn't help but, with Michael Evans' work on the gap junctions and the way that cellular collectives can forge these higher level identities when they stop asking or caring where this message came from. Um, it it makes me think of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, the Jesuit paleontologist who had this vision of the noosphere arising, and that human beings wouldn't be forfeiting their individual personalities as they became part of this larger collective consciousness, but actually deepening our sense of um, individuality or individuating, maybe in the Jungian sense. Um, and what I'm going to say right now is not science. It's not knowledge that I have. It's more like myth, or what Plato would call a likely story. And it's a function of moral and etheric imagination. Uh, there's, I think, really one human being, and that one human being, in order to grow and develop, has differentiated itself into many, many human beings. And the thing about, the cells that compose our bodies, it's a lot easier for them to mind meld, because, every one of my cells has the same DNA. They might differentiate and specialize a little bit, but they're pretty much copies of each other.
Mhm.
Human beings are so unique and have such diverse life experiences and inheritances, and yet we're still members of one body. But it's much more difficult for us to look at each other in the face and not ask or get hung up on uh, the difference between where my thoughts come from and where your thoughts come from. The universe is up in the ante with human beings, and we're in this threshold moment where, as a species, we're attempting to break through to another level of self-organization. Not one wherein we would lose our sense of individuality, but one where that sense of individuality could be in service of the whole.
Mhm.
And it's painful and it's frightening. And we live in a cultural container age, actually, right now, that is um, like the contractions before uh, birth, and we feel like everything's closing in on us, and like everything we used to know and feel comfortable with um, is ending, and we can't see what's on the other side of this birth now, and it might get worse before it gets better. But I have faith in the trajectory that we're on, because again, if we know more about the history of the cosmos than we ever have before. Still plenty of mystery, still plenty of new things to learn, but there have been these moments of creative emergence and breakthrough in the past where, like, you know, if we were to rewind the clock and just look at clouds of hydrogen gas, would anyone have predicted stars and galaxies out of that? And so we're caught up in this creative process. We have a role to play. It, it doesn't involve forfeiting our sense of individual uniqueness, but I think we have to go through that and out the other side to meet one another in this higher identity.
Mhm.
And it might take 1,000 years.
Mhm.
But again, as a product of my moral imagination, um, I can't help but tend toward uh, something like reincarnation as a serious, um, I don't want to say hypothesis. That's because I don't hold it that lightly. But it's a moral imagination
Mhm.
that we have all been here before. We will be here again. Not, I won't be Matt. You won't be Roman,
Right.
but Roman and Matt will be part of what we inherit when we come back.
Yeah. Yeah.
right? I don't think of reincarnation as, oh, I was this one special individual in the past, and then I was this other special individual in the past. It's like one of my mentors, Robert McDermott, always says, nobody imagines or remembers being a peasant woman in their past life. It's always Cleopatra or whatever. I think we've all been everyone, you know, and reincarnation is more of that, um, a collective process of rebirth. And, we're all going through it. And that experience of being at the coffee shop, I mean, that's where I am right now. And just longing for that moment of collective mutual recognition. I think we're all feeling it.
Yeah.
We're all feeling it. We have to feed that desire and take it seriously, and that'll get us through.
That's a great place to end. That's a great place to end. Yeah. Well, thank you. And yeah, I would love to do this as often as you're willing. Um,
Yeah, I love your questions. I love the inquiry you're engaged in. Just the way you articulate your situation, our situation is really moving. So I would really enjoy doing this again.
yeah, well, I have great respect for you. So let's keep the conversation going.